Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm here today to talk to you about there we go, digital transitioning versus digital transformation, largely with an identity context because that's my background. So my name's Jason Banks. I'm the Head of Strategy and Innovation at Identity Experts, and part of my role is looking at how we roll out projects, how we engage with people, and actually just the nature of the projects that people want to engage with and how we can help them move things forward. And I'm particularly interested in this because it is the nature of what we do as identity consultants. If you want to do a digital transition, frequently need identity involved. If you want to do a transformation, you're even more likely to need to look at the identity piece. So it is a very big part of what we do, if not directly, purely as an enablement. So when you think of digital transformation, what kind of things do you usually think that is going to involve? So for some people, this is taking back office functions, augmenting them. So this might be taking things like Teams on board, getting that online, implementing things like joiner, mover, leaver processes, actually just taking existing paper processes and making them digitally accessible. So taking requisition processes and embedding them into things like ServiceNow so that there's a ticket, it's tracked, and we can start to manage and process our entire business processes themselves digitally rather than through manual paper systems. The reality of this is, however, that actually a lot of those things that I've just mentioned are more transitioning. We're taking something that is existing as a process, either an existing automate system, automating it, improving how it joins up, and a lot of this is actually plumbing. It's very, very necessary. I wouldn't want to live in a house without a modern plumbing system, but it's serving a very, very specific purpose. Whereas when we're looking at transformation, we're actually looking at this from a human point of view. How do we engage? Where do we make things? How do we put things in the right people's hands so that they can be accessible in a way that makes sense? So one of the earliest examples of this I ever saw was doing some work with the HMRC, where we had a very, very workable IT identity management platform. And we actually parked the project for 6 months while we brought a business analyst in, who spent quite a bit of time actually going out and talking to people in the business to find out what language made sense to them. So rather than us presenting an identity management system using identity management and technology language, we reworded the entirety of the application. Not a very technical change, but a very important one to actually try and make the application as simple to use for people who weren't part of the IT world. Now, it still sounds like these things are very similar, and it's very easy to confuse the two. And the way I try to explain this to people in the simplest way possible is transition is process oriented, and we're moving from a process and we're looking up the stack, and we're looking at from there we look at the applications and then finally the people. From a transformation, we're actually looking at the people first, and then we're looking back down in the opposite direction, and we're actually looking at that point to say, well, this is actually what people want to be able to do. How does that impact the technology choices? How does that mean that the processes might need to change? So it is all about perspective, and sometimes it's not an easy mindset to see because you're actually looking at the same problem domain. It's just a question of where you stand. So traditionally, transformation was frequently about saving money. Can we do this faster, fewer resources, fewer people even? Freeing up time, this is a personal favourite of mine. Not so much can we get rid of people, but can we actually take some of the work that they're currently doing, automate it, because then they are adding value. Brilliant example of this for me is things like password resets. I don't want to go and have to make a phone call to a service desk, try and demonstrate that I am the person that actually does hold that account, and please can I have a password reset on that, when I can just use SSPR, self-service password reset, initiate that process myself, do it securely, do it safely, but actually still get that password reset done frequently a lot faster. And in the meantime, the service desk are actually dealing with the more challenging problems where they can add real value. So there's a particular issue, somebody hasn't got a license quite correct, there's a machine not being configured properly, where they've actually got to go and do much more intense interventions. And finally, and again, this is always an entertaining one for me, creating new opportunities. So, and I think this is something that we are beginning to see the start of with the no-code, low-code movement, by bringing in a technology that means we can actually put automation tooling, programming tooling into the hands of people who haven't normally had it. That gives us the ability to bring in new ideas, new concepts, distribute workloads. There are lots of opportunities here, which I personally am very excited about, because actually this means we can all focus on those areas that we have interests in. So I'll just pause here to say one of the big things that we're looking at is context is actually key. It's all about perspective. It's all about the context. What is the purpose of what we're trying to do? Is this a cost-saving exercise? Is this we're trying to become leaner, meaner, more agile? It really does change what the objectives are as to where we're trying to go. Are we aiming for a transition here? Which is perfectly fine, perfectly valid, and actually has a lot of benefits, and sometimes is actually a necessary step. If you're looking at a big program of work that is going to be very transformative, sometimes it's actually better to say, well, day one, we'll transition some bits here, we'll move this system here so it's more accessible, just to make it easier downstream and safer for us to make that move later. And looking at that, we'll just take some real world examples. So I'm sure everybody has noticed that over the last 18 months or so, for various reasons, we've been making a lot of changes to how people work. So we've been forced into making some very rapid decisions, some huge changes in how people are working and where they are working and what tools they're using. I personally think that supply issue is a big reason of why I can't get a shiny new graphics card for my PC at home, because all the silicon that's needed for it is off building laptops for people. But the thing is here, this is largely transition. We're taking about somebody who's working at a desk in an office, we've transitioned them out to their home office. We've had to build VPNs, we've had to build other forms of collaboration platforms, and this is very much, we're doing the same things, but the location that we are working from has been updated and has changed by necessity. I'll be the first one to say I personally would not want to be in an office even this week, even with the vaccines rolling out. I'm still not at that comfort level, but I appreciate everybody is different. Not everybody has the luxury of space available. So, but it is very much, I'm doing very much the same job I was doing 6 months, 12 months, 2 years ago. I'm just not traveling. I'm not going on to into other people's offices anymore. And I think there's a lot of that going on. It's the same job, it's the same work, it's just the location that's changed. And very much falls into that transition category. We're not transforming how we've worked, we've just moved it somewhere else. So again, it is very, very similar. It is the same problem that we're solving, but just as some thinking about how we can differentiate and think about these two elements. For transitioning, we're improving availability, accessibility, and tools. That is things like Teams, VPNs, remote access. We're automating things. I've spent the best part of 20 plus years now building joiner, mover, lever solutions to automate identity provisioning, onboarding, transfers, and offboarding people. That is purely automating manual tasks, because we don't need to have somebody physically going into a lot of back-end systems anymore. Maximizing efficiencies. These are all very, very valid, very, very important things. Brilliant one in terms of the current situation is actually, because we're reducing travel, I can get through a lot more meetings in a week. I don't need to think, well, I've got to travel for 5 hours to get from home to an office, stay in a hotel overnight, travel to the next place. I can do 3 meetings in a day, and that's completely fine. I'm more efficient that way, and I'm sure there's lots of us having similar experiences there, where actually some of that dead time that we used to spend on the road or in a traditional setting has vanished. Whereas I think transformation is when we are looking at innovating, we're looking at changing from the top down. And again, this is this idea that rather than starting from the process and saying, how do we make this more efficient, we actually look at the people that we have in our business and say, okay, how do I make their jobs most efficient? How do I best enable that person to perform their role? And it is that people centricity rather than the process centricity that I think really adds the value to this. And to be honest, gives us the really exciting part of this, because actually people respond to this quite well. I've found it is about them. It is about how to make somebody's working life better, more fulfilling, more effective. And not just the case of saying to people, okay, we don't need you to do these 3 things anymore, which always makes people uncomfortable. Even when it's explained well, it's planned well, and there isn't a plan to start saying, well, we don't actually need quite as many people on that service desk anymore. We're not doing those self-service password we're not doing those password resets any longer. So we can at least try and make sure that we're bringing more people with us. It improves our engagement, improves our buy-in. And I think that buy-in is important, because it is about building this culture and mindset very much from the top down. This is very much a leadership focused approach, where we can actually be saying to people in our environments, actually, you're important. We are building literally our processes around you. So hopefully that clarifies really where I certainly see the difference between transition. Very, very important. We need that plumbing in place. Transformation actually takes us on a slightly different journey. We get similar outcomes, but hopefully we can do it in a much more rewarding way. So again, it is one of those strange areas. It is the same problem set. The words and transition versus transformation do get very, very blurry on occasion. Even when you're working in this space, it's very easy to slip from one to the other. So one of the things that I certainly look at a lot at is the language that we use. How do we speak when we are defining identity solutions? It's something I'm very, very interested in, because the words that we choose to use, the language that we use, frames the discussion. And in some ways it's great. I can use a kind of shorthand in the office when I start talking about certain patterns within an identity solution. But equally, when we're looking at these projects, the wording, the language that we're using can become quite important. So I think using words like digital advancement, as a really good example to say, actually, this is a journey. We are moving people forward. We're moving the business forward. This isn't just about changing the plumbing around, even when it is. And I think that's some kind of piece, a very important piece of the puzzle, because it helps us bring people with us. It helps us get that engagement that makes these projects become, if not easier, at least smoother. People aren't going to be fighting it in the same way that they can do, because again, people see these things coming, they start worrying about the change. People inherently are sometimes quite nervous, particularly, again, back to current events. There are lots of things already changing for people. I think bringing in additional changes can be quite frightening, even when they are very well intentioned. So I think it is, again, worth saying we should be championing the different ways of working. One of the things that I'm, again, very, very interested in personally is diversity in the workplace. I'm an autistic person. I find that my view of the world is different to most other people's, and that's fine. That gives me a perspective that can be valuable sometimes, not always, but again, it's having those different voices to be heard. It's the same reason I think that we do need as many different people with as many different backgrounds in working in our environments, because we never know where that next idea that is important will come from. And this kind of approach, this kind of thought process and leadership actually say we value transformation, we want the advancement, and we want people to be at the table talking to us about their ideas. It is more than saying, well, we don't just want to, we're not going to have this big program of work to say, please take Teams, go home, or Zoom, or whatever the platform happens to be. Actually, what else have we missed? What other ideas are out there that we would benefit from? That creating an environment that shows that kind of input is valued and respected really does give us those opportunities to have these things come to the forefront. And again, I'm probably blurring the lines slightly. This is probably where I should have had most of that discussion, because it is worth differentiating the two. It is worth actually calling out some things a transformation, some things a transition. Some things will hopefully become more than that. And it is about your goals and challenges may have different needs. If you just have an urgent issue that needs to be addressed, frequently we will come in, we will have a look at somebody's identity environment, and we'll look at it and think, oh, you have got problems here. Not that often, fortunately, but sometimes, particularly when people haven't had good identity management practices in place, they have huge volumes, huge numbers of unknown accounts. They've got identities which are disjointed, don't bear any form of consistency. They can't say with any reliability who has access to anything or why. And so that's the kind of thing where actually you just need to transition in some good basic foundations as quickly as you can. And then come back and look at the more transformative approach, probably in a future phase. And that's fine. That actually becomes an important step along the journey. And as I mentioned earlier, actually, sometimes it is important to say we're not going to do everything in one step. We will take lots of steps. And some of those steps might just be a pure transition. We do have different technologies available. So if you think about where we were even a few years ago, the most cutting edge collaboration tools were things like Skype. Now we have Teams, we have Zoom, we have a lot of work coming into these spaces, into these environments. Slack is another example. And the work that is going into those particular platforms to make sure people can do more of their role within those platforms. So as an example, we have a timesheet system, we're a consultancy. I might book time to various different projects during a working day. And it's actually embedded into my Teams experience. I don't need to go and find a second application and log into it and go all of those things. It's actually at my fingertips. It's easy. It's removing those barriers. Again, things like no code, low code is very brilliant in democratizing and making all of these things accessible. One of our, in fact, our timesheet application, which was built by one of my colleagues in the EMS team, is an avowed non-developer, but was perfectly capable of building, a very successful, very highly thought of application that we use within identity experts. If not every day, then at least very, very regularly, because it is at our fingertips. It was easy for him to build, easy for him to integrate, easy for us to all engage with and make use of. And there are lots more of these things becoming available to us. That's obviously a very Microsoft-centric example. Slack has exactly the same tooling available. We've got Salesforce, who are again making lots of things available within their platform for application development. Lots of interesting work going in on a lot of these big cloud-centric solutions, where actually it is about putting tools into people's hands. And I think that, for me, really brings it all the way back down to, it is a people-centric approach. It does highlight different requirements. If you're aiming for something very, very basic, again, you're trying to put in an emergency joiner solution because you don't have one in place, then from an identity perspective, that's a very simple transition. But you're building something that is to serve a very particular, very key focus. When you're then trying to say, well, actually, we're then going to distribute and delegate the management of our IT, so that rather than access to applications being an IT function, it becomes a business function. So if I need access to Visio, I can go to a catalog, I can apply for it. It can then go through an approvals process, but that might go to my line manager. And my line manager is at no point thinking, have we got licenses available? Do we have software media available? Any of those IT things. He's just saying, actually, does he really need Visio to do his day job? Yes or no? Does he need access to Salesforce? Yes, no. It becomes much simpler, and the systems that we can build allow that to happen as a business decision rather than as a technology decision. So, which is best, which I think is one of the key questions. It depends on your goals. It very much depends on your organization. And I think where it can get a little bit complicated is depends on the Bs. So with this, baggage, budget, buy-in. When I say baggage, this isn't meant, oh, you're carrying around all sorts of issues. It's more about things like, is there any existing technical debt? Do you work in a regulated environment? And there are things that certainly I've encountered in identity management, where you get lots of scenarios where there are very, very strict penalties around things like separation of duties. So one example of that was working within a utilities company. People responsible for power generation must not be in any way, shape or form able to access the same applications that would give them access to power sales, as an example, because obviously they would know what the generation output was. They'll be able to play the market. So there were very, very strict controls and very, very strict penalties for that particular set of conditions. And that is part of that baggage. That is some of the reality that lots of people face in their day-to-day businesses, because actually they do have these constraints that they have to follow. Simple things. People in an educational context mustn't allow their student data to go out of their country's control. Simple things like that. It just builds a constraint that we need to be aware of. Obviously, budget. Some of these things are a lot more expensive to do than others, but equally, the way that the technology industry is moving seems very much towards democratization. It is very much around trying to make more of these things cloud-based, almost turnkey on occasion, and actually put the right tools into the hands of those people who need them most and can use them most, rather than it being purely a technology issue. So budget can be both a benefit and it can also be a concern, because obviously, some of these things do need to be paid for. Some of them can be quite expensive. So there's always this thing to bear in mind, that actually sometimes it is easier than others. Sometimes actually there just isn't an appetite for this because people don't really see the value, or they would like it but they can't afford it, or there is some other element that is stopping a change. So in conclusion, hopefully that's been useful. Really just to clarify thinking, because obviously we use these words interchangeably. We do need to be aware of that. It is easy to drift from one to the other, and I will put my hands up and say I am as guilty of that as the next. I frequently will say one when I'm talking about the other, because it's just the way our language has changed over time, and how we use things. And I think that the thing to bear in mind is there are real opportunities here. There's lots of things are moving and changing purely within IT. We'll limit it to that, but we obviously know there are other things happening in the world. But if you look at the way that the IT platforms have moved and changed and evolved very, very recently, I'm certainly thinking this is an exciting time to be involved, because actually we're moving where the conversations are happening. If I can put in a connector from Workday into Active Directory in a couple of days now, instead of it being 20, 30 days of development time, that's great. It's brilliant for a business. It's brilliant for me. And it just means we can now start adding more value. It can become more transitional when we're dealing with the plumbing, and transformational because we now have more breathing room to actually look at how we want to operate with these things. Okay, so I think that wraps up in terms of the presentation. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in. We do have one, which is, do we think the future will favour one or the other, or will it continue to rely on context? I suspect it will always be contextual. I think, though, that it will become a lot more. Hopefully, I'm hoping that we will, as we gain a better understanding of the terms that we're using, we will actually start seeing these things as blocks, and we can actually say, well, actually, I will take a transitional approach here because I need to change something quickly. I will take a more transformative approach when I'm looking at things and I want to get a different perspective. I want to perhaps look at the process and say, is this the right way to do things? An example of this would be things like the secure hybrid identity approach that we've been working on at Identity Experts, where instead of coming in and saying, oh, you must have zero trust and you must have a JML and you must have Microsoft Identity Manager, we're actually saying, okay, let's have a look at your identities. Let's have a look at the things that you want to have accessible to your identities. So basically, who are the people you want to work with? What are the resources or services that you want them to access? And how do you want to trust them? And let's go backwards from there rather than start to say, well, you must have AD or you must have Azure. Actually, let's look at this from the user back down the stack, and then the technology choices will make themselves. So I think in answer to the question, it is very much contextual, but I don't actually see that as being a bad thing. Sometimes a digital transition is actually perfectly valid, actually of vast benefit, and sometimes it's actually just a step within a larger transformative plan. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can wrap up there. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. We will be making a recording available via YouTube. Link will be sent out to you all, and hopefully I'll be with you in good time. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks now.